We live in a world where we are told that what we have just isn't enough. We need more and more and more. We are taught to look at what we do not have. We are taught to have the mindset of scarcity. One example of this is the headlines that we had around 6 months ago at the beginning of lockdown. The pictures of empty shelves in supermarkets might come to your mind. And the media making us question how much toilet roll and pasta we should have in our houses, and then prompting us to go out and buy more, even though there was enough at home. This way of existing is worrying, and if we aren't careful, this can affect our lives of faith as well. Our first Bible passage for today, which is Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 44, is a story that might be familiar to you. Jesus miraculously feeds 5,000 men and also all the women and children on top of that number. You might be questioning why we look at this story when we're celebrating harvest as a church family. But I think it speaks into having a viewpoint of abundance rather than that of scarcity. At the beginning of this passage, the disciples are returning from this area of Galilee. They have just finished a time of casting out demons, healing the sick, and calling people to repentance. You can read more about this in verses 6 to 13 earlier on in the chapter in Mark. They were equipped with power by the authority of Jesus. They've had experience of how God can use them in a way which is far beyond their own ability. Once they had returned, however, Jesus took them to rest, to eat and to be restored so they could carry on in the ministry together. However, they were met with a huge crowd seeking Jesus. Jesus has compassion on the people and teaches them. As the day goes on, the disciples notice a need. People don't have food, and it was getting late. They might not be able to eat, and they were very hungry. They share this concern with Jesus, and he places the responsibility back onto the disciples, saying, "You feed them." At this point, the disciples turn to look at the situation, and they see what they do not have and what they cannot do. They see the amount of people, and they notice that they couldn't feed them at that point, and they know they haven't got the provision to meet the need that was in front of them. Their focus was solely on what they do not have. It is at this point that Jesus turns to them and suggests a shift of focus. Rather than joining them in the narrative of scarcity, Jesus invites the disciples to look to what they have. They search the crowd and find 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish. This very small amount of food. And it wouldn't have been able to feed everyone that was there. It probably would have only managed one person, if that. However, it is all that they had. The disciples had 5 loaves, 2 fish, and God. This same God who created the universe and who had just empowered them for the wonders they had done going around the villages, casting out demons, healing the sick, and everything else that they did. And the list of 5 loaves, 2 fish, and God is more than enough. The smallest of offerings is a thing of abundance when God is involved. Our second Bible passage for today is Leviticus 19, verses 9 to 10. And this might fill you with a little bit of dread, as Leviticus is filled with many rules and laws. However, although it can be a hard read at times, Leviticus shows us how life should look when the Israelites live in relationship with God in their historical context. When reading it, we can see elements of how Israelite society should have functioned. Although society is very different now, there are elements we can draw from this for our living. The laws we are looking at focus on how to harvest ethically. The Israelite people are told to leave areas of their crops, not pick crops from the floor, and if they missed crops in the first walk through the fields, to leave them behind. This rejects the natural thought of what is mine, and promotes the responsibility of those who own fields. This is a legally built-in poverty relief measure for society, so that those in poverty can collect food or glean from already harvested foods to have food to eat. This law challenges how field owners see their produce, and it challenges them and invites them into seeing God's abundance rather than seeing the world through the eyes of scarcity. With the eyes of scarcity, the field owner would want every drop of produce harvested and in their barns. No one else could have any of it, as the owner needs it because it might not be enough. There is a lack of trust in the provision of God. At the time these laws were given to Israel, they were in the wilderness just after leaving Egypt, and they are receiving the daily provision of manna from God. However, if they tried to store up the manna out of fear of a lack of God's provision, it would rot and be unsuitable for consumption. See Exodus 16:19-20 if you want to read more about the manna. They had a daily reminder to trust God to provide what they need when they needed it. When seeing the crops through the eyes of abundance, the field owner is seeing what God has provided and knows that they will not go without as they trust God to provide. In leaving crops behind for others, it is a visible sign of the trust the owner would have in God's abundant provision. This trust in God's abundant provision then allows those in need to receive what they needed. The harvester knows that what they collect in the first walk through of the field is enough for them. They trust the leftover crops to those who need it, even though the field owners have no further involvement in the gleaning process. This way of harvesting crops is based upon a just outworking of a relationship with God. And when done in obedience to the Levitical law, it shows an attitude of abundance. What they had harvested from the fields was enough because God was involved in the relationship. The seemingly small offering of 5 loaves and 2 fish to God from the story in Mark brought about an abundance of food for all the people who had come to see Jesus that day. There is no offering too small for God to use in abundance. The Levitical law preventing over-harvesting of crops shows how we can live a life in abundant trust to God. Whatever we have is a thing of abundance when God is involved and it is offered to him as an offering. We are at a point in lockdown where things seem to be getting worse again and more restrictions are coming into place. The situation we find ourselves in can lead us to see the world through the eyes of scarcity. We see what we do not have and what we can't do. We can then become selfish and untrusting in our outlook and behaviours. However, throughout the Bible and in the world today, God is calling his people to see the world through the eyes of his abundance, where we can see what we do have and what we can do rather than restrictions and limitations. Although we are not able to gather in a way we would like, and it seems to be getting stricter, this isn't a dead end. We still have the ability to proclaim the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus through our speech, thoughts, and actions wherever we find ourselves. We have a providing God who we celebrate and worship, especially at harvest, who provides not only the physical necessities like food, but also opportunities for us, his people, to be displayers of his holiness, justice, and glory in the world today. The amazing thing is that we always have something to offer to God to use. We have tangible objects to offer to God. Yes, our food, our money, our services. However, we also have ourselves, our lives, our all that we can give to God on a daily, moment-by-moment basis. Let's choose to live with eyes of God's abundance, rather than living a life of faith with limited trust, which is punctuated with selfishness and injustice. Today, we can know that whatever we give to God, however small or seemingly insignificant, He can take and use to do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine in the world around us. The question is, are you seeing the world through the eyes of what I can't do rather than what I can do? Do you choose to see the world through the eyes of God's abundance? Are you holding back from offering to God what might seem insignificant and small to you, but could do miraculous things with God? Are you following through on the opportunities you see to proclaim Christ in all you do, wherever you find yourself? What's your answer?